Before we begin, let me welcome you to this corner of the internet where stories of family, sacrifice, and resilience find a home. If this tale speaks to you, I invite you, quietly, sincerely, to subscribe so that more voices and more lessons from ordinary lives can reach us all. Title of today's story: I sold my house to my son and learned I was only a backup plan. The papers lay on the polished oak desk like a silent threat. The lawyer slid them toward me with careful hands, his voice dropping low, as if secrets had been hidden between the typed lines. "Ma'am," he said gently, "are you certain you want to sign this?" His eyes lingered longer than they needed to, as if he knew something I didn't. The words carried both professional courtesy and personal warning. I looked down at the crisp stack of legal pages, my house deed, my future, and then at my son sitting across the table. His fiancée clutched his arm with the excitement of youth, her nails painted in a shade that seemed too sharp for the occasion. My pen trembled in my hand. It was supposed to be a gift. That's what I told myself when this idea first took root. A home is more than bricks and wood. It is a blessing, a shelter, a promise. I had raised my son in that house, patched skinned knees in the kitchen, hung report cards on the refrigerator, and prayed in the small hours when fever struck. Every wall carried a memory. When he came to me, eyes bright, voice earnest, "Mom, we're planning the wedding, but we need a place of our own," I felt both pride and urgency. My son was building a life, and I wanted to be the foundation beneath it. So I said yes. Yes, I would sell the house and put it in his name. Yes, I would step aside to let the next chapter of his story be written. That is what mothers do, isn't it? We carve pieces of ourselves away so our children might grow taller. And yet, as the lawyer's question hovered in the air, I felt something stir inside me. A faint unease like the shift of a floorboard in the middle of the night. Love pulled me in one direction, instinct tugged the other way. I caught my son's smile, nervous but eager. Then I glanced at his fiancée, who looked at me not with warmth but with calculation. It was subtle, almost invisible, the kind of expression only a mother would notice. A flicker of ownership, as if she were already rearranging furniture in her mind, already moving me out of the frame. My heart ached with conflict. Was I reading too much into it? Or was I about to give away not just a house, but my place in his life? The lawyer cleared his throat softly, bringing me back to the desk, the pen, the waiting silence. That was the moment when love for my son and the whisper of doubt met in the space between my hand and the page. And though I didn't know it yet, that hesitation would become the thread pulling apart the tapestry of everything I thought I understood about family, loyalty, and the fine print hidden not just in contracts, but in people's hearts. The weeks that followed were filled with ribbons and lists, laughter and endless conversations about flowers, menus, and seating charts. My son and his fiancée perched at the kitchen table night after night, their heads bent together as if the world beyond those details no longer existed. I hovered nearby, happy to be included, happy to offer my opinion when asked. I opened my checkbook more than once, not out of obligation, but from the quiet joy that comes with helping your child start something new. When the florist's bill looked larger than expected, I insisted on covering it. When the caterer required a deposit, I wrote the check before they could even ask. It felt good, comforting, to believe I was still woven into the fabric of their future. One afternoon, I sat in the living room, wrapping delicate porcelain teacups in tissue paper. They were part of the dowry chest I had begun to assemble. Linens embroidered with my mother's initials, a quilt I had stitched over long winter nights, small heirlooms passed down like whispered blessings through generations. As my hands folded the paper, I imagined my son's new wife using them, perhaps serving tea to friends, unaware of the stories embedded in each fragile handle. The house buzzed with anticipation. Streamers hung from doorways. The spare room overflowed with boxes of favors. I found myself smiling often, though there were moments, small, fleeting, when I felt like a guest rather than a hostess in my own home. It began innocently enough. One evening, as my son and his fiancée poured over invitations, she said lightly, "We'll need to think about where to put everything once we move in. Maybe we can clear out the back bedroom. It would make a perfect office." My son nodded distractedly, scribbling notes on a pad. Yeah, good idea. I looked up from the lace veil I had been ironing. The back bedroom? I asked. That's where I've kept the family photo albums. She smiled quickly, a smile practiced enough to soften the edge in her words. Of course, we'll keep the important things, but we need space, don't we? A home should feel like ours. There it was again, that word, ours. I swallowed, forcing my own smile. Yes, I said, of course. Still, when I returned to my room later, the word echoed in my chest. But the wedding preparations swept me along, and I pushed the unease aside. There were dresses to be fitted, favors to assemble, programs to fold. I found joy in the small tasks, tying ribbons onto tiny boxes of sugared almonds, arranging roses in a vase for the rehearsal dinner, ironing the hem of her gown as if it were my own daughter's. Each gesture, each quiet act of service was my way of saying, I am with you. I believe in you. I am still needed. One evening, as I tucked the quilt into the cedar chest, my son wandered in, his tie loosened, his face tired but glowing. Mom, he said softly, thank you for everything, for all of this. He gestured to the room filled with wrapped gifts and carefully folded linens. I reached up to smooth his hair, the way I had when he was small. It's what mothers do, I told him. And for that moment, I let myself believe it was enough. It was late on a Tuesday evening when the first real crack appeared. We had just finished dinner, the kind of meal that used to draw laughter and stories, but now passed in quiet bites. My son rinsed the plates while his fiancée scrolled through her phone, her face lit by its glow. Without looking up, she said, we need more privacy once we're married. Don't you think, sweetheart? My son dried his hands on a towel, hesitating just long enough for me to notice. Yeah, he murmured, we should talk about that. The words slipped into the room like a cold draft. I set my fork down slowly. Privacy? I asked. She smiled, that same rehearsed smile she always wore when the truth pressed too close to the surface. Of course, every couple needs their own space, their own routines. It's healthy. My son shifted uneasily but didn't meet my eyes. I nodded, though my heart felt heavier than it had in months. I understand, I said, though I wasn't sure that I did. The requests began to multiply, each one small enough to seem harmless on its own. Could you not use the living room when we're watching our shows? It's distracting. Maybe it would be better if you ate earlier, so we can have dinner just the two of us. You don't mind moving your sewing table upstairs, do you? It's kind of in the way. Every concession I made was framed as temporary, practical, inevitable. Yet each one nudged me further to the edges of my own home. I tried not to take it personally. Young love needs room to breathe, I reminded myself. A mother should not cling too tightly. And yet, the silence that followed my son's compliance, the way he avoided my gaze, the way he deferred to her, gnawed at me. One night, I overheard them in the kitchen. I hadn't meant to listen, but voices carry differently in a quiet house. She's always around, his fiancée whispered. It doesn't feel like our place. She's my mother, my son replied, his voice low, weary. I know, but it's suffocating. If we're going to start a life together, she needs to give us space. The words cut sharper than I expected. Give us space. I thought of the hours I'd spent folding ribbons, writing checks, packing up heirlooms. Space, I realized, was what I had been giving them all along. Still, apparently, it wasn't enough. The next morning, I found myself standing at the window, watching them leave for work. He kissed her cheek, she laughed, and they walked down the driveway arm in arm. For a moment, they looked every bit the young couple I wanted them to be. Hopeful, full of promise, unaware of how quickly love can turn brittle when selfishness seeps in. I pressed my hand against the glass, the cool pain steadying me. I had told myself I was still part of this family, still needed, still welcome. But as the car disappeared down the street, a thought I had been avoiding finally found its voice. Perhaps I was already a guest in my own home. The house had always been alive during meal times. When my son was a boy, dinner was our tether. We'd sit around the same oak table, chipped at the edges from years of homework and spilled juice, and share the kind of stories that make families whole. Even on the hardest days, we laughed. Even when money was thin, there was warmth at that table. But lately, the air had changed. Dinner no longer belonged to us, it belonged to the silence. It was a Thursday night. I had spent the afternoon simmering a pot roast, the kind my son used to beg for on his birthdays. The smell filled the house, rich and comforting, and I hoped it might soften the distance that had grown between us. I set the table with care, placing the heavy silverware his grandmother had given me, laying a folded napkin at each seat. I even lit the candles, something I hadn't done in years, telling myself that a little glow might remind them of love. When they walked in, my son barely glanced at the meal. His fiancée wrinkled her nose as if the air itself offended her. "I thought we said we'd order Thai tonight," she said, slipping her shoes off and tossing her bag onto the couch. "I cooked," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice light. "Your favorite, sweetheart, pot roast." My son hesitated, caught between the comfort of his past and the pull of his future. "Smells good," he said finally, though he did not meet my eyes. We sat, the three of us around the same table, yet each on a separate island. The clink of silverware against porcelain echoed louder than words. I tried to fill the silence. "How are the wedding plans coming along?" I asked, forcing cheer. "They're fine," his fiancée answered, her tone clipped, her gaze locked on the screen of her phone. "And the caterer, did they?" "We've handled it," she interrupted. Then, turning to my son with a smile soft enough to melt butter, she added, "Haven't we?" He nodded. "Yeah, we've got it covered, Mom." Mom, the word should have soothed me, but in that moment it felt like a barrier. A reminder that I was outside the circle they were drawing. The roast cooled on our plates. They spoke in half sentences, in murmurs meant for each other, while I chewed slowly, tasting nothing. For the first time in my life, I felt invisible at my own table. Later that night, I carried the dishes to the sink. My son was in the living room, laughing at something on television, her laughter joining his. The sound should have filled me with joy, but instead it pressed against my chest until I could hardly breathe. As I scrubbed the plates, I remembered another dinner years ago when he was 10. He had burst through the door after baseball practice, sweaty and triumphant, clutching a crumpled homework paper in his fist. "Mom, look, 100," he'd shouted. We ate spaghetti that night, and he talked so much his words tumbled over each other. I had listened with all the pride in the world. That memory felt like a ghost now, close enough to ache, too far to touch. The next evening I tried again. I baked apple pie, his father's recipe, the one that left cinnamon clinging to the walls. When I set it on the counter, my son smiled faintly. Before he could speak, she placed her hand on his arm. "Honey, don't eat too much dessert. We're doing engagement photos tomorrow, remember?" He laughed nervously, pushing the plate away. "She's right, Mom. Gotta look good for the pictures." And with that, another piece of me was folded into silence. That night, alone in my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the framed photograph of my late husband. He was young in the picture, his arm wrapped around me, pride shining in his eyes. "You'd know what to say," I whispered to him. "You'd know how to make him see me." But the photograph remained still, offering no answers, only memories. Dinner used to be a gathering. Now it was a rehearsal for absence. And though I still cooked, still set the table, still prayed over the meal, the truth was beginning to settle inside me with a weight I could no longer deny. I was becoming a stranger in my own home. The house was quiet one afternoon, too quiet for a place preparing for a wedding. My son had gone to work. His fiancée was out meeting friends. I lingered in the living room, the quilt half folded in my lap, trying to shake the hollow ache that dinners had left behind. I rose to put the quilt away and, without thinking, opened the sideboard drawer where I usually kept linens. Instead of fabric, I found a manila envelope. My first thought was that it might be wedding invitations, but the envelope was thick, heavier than paper meant to celebrate. I slid it out, careful, almost guilty, though I wasn't sure why. The first page bore the header of a law office, not the one we had used to sign over the house, but another. My eyes scanned the lines, at first struggling to piece the meaning together. And then the words became clear. Transfer of ownership, exclusive rights, residency subject to revocation. My breath caught. I read again, slower this time, as if maybe I had misunderstood. But the intent was plain. The house, my house, had been placed entirely under my son's name. There was no mention of me, no clause of protection, no acknowledgement that this roof had sheltered me for decades, that every wall carried the echoes of my life. And tucked inside, clipped neatly, was a note in her handwriting. "Once this is signed, everything will be official. We'll finally have our own place." The room tilted around me. I sat down hard in the chair, the paper trembling in my hands. It wasn't just the legal language, it was the clarity of it. I was being erased. My mind rushed back to the lawyer's gentle whisper weeks before. Are you certain you want to sign this? At the time, I had thought he was merely cautious. Now, I wondered if he had seen more than I wanted to admit. I placed the papers back exactly as I'd found them, smoothing the envelope as though it had never been touched, but nothing inside me was smooth. My chest was tight, my pulse loud in my ears. That evening they returned together, laughter spilling into the house. She dropped her coat on the chair, chatting about floral arrangements. My son kissed her cheek, then glanced at me. You okay, Mom? He asked, almost as an afterthought. I'm fine, I said, the words tasting like ash. I wanted to ask him. I wanted to hold up the papers, to demand an explanation, to beg for honesty. But the sight of his tired smile, the way he leaned into her warmth, stopped me. If he had signed those papers, if he had agreed to this, what good would my asking do? So I stayed quiet. Later that night, when the house had settled into sleep, I sat by the window with the envelope now hidden under my own quilt. I thought of my late husband, of the promises we had made when we bought this house together. This will always be our anchor, he had said, hammer in hand, sweat on his brow, when he fixed the roof that first summer. I had believed him. I still did, but anchors rust when left unattended. As dawn edged into the sky, I made myself a cup of coffee and stared at the rising steam. My son's words from years ago played in my head. Mom, don't ever sell this house. It's the only place that feels like home. Now it seemed he had forgotten, or perhaps, with her at his side, he had been persuaded to forget. Either way, the papers in the drawer had spoken louder than promises. And I realized, with a chill that cut deeper than any winter draft, that if I did not act, I would lose more than just a house. I would lose my place in my own family. Sleep became a stranger to me after I found those papers. The house creaked with every memory, every betrayal, and I lay awake counting them like cracks in the ceiling. By dawn, I gave up on rest and wandered into the kitchen. The kettle hissed, the smell of coffee rising, and for a moment I almost reached for the second cup I used to pour for my husband. Habit still clung to me after all these years. I set the cup down empty. It was his voice I heard as I sat there, alone with my thoughts. Don't ever let go of this place, Maggie. It's not just walls, it's us. I could see him hammer in hand up on the roof the summer we bought it. I had been pregnant then, nervous about money, about the future. He had looked down at me with that grin of his, sweat running into his eyes, and said, This house will hold us no matter what, you'll see. And he had been right. The house had held us through scraped knees, teenage tempers, late night arguments, and morning reconciliations. It had held us when cancer came for him, when I sat beside his hospital bed and prayed until my voice was hoarse. When he was gone, it was this house that steadied me, these walls that caught my tears. To give it away now felt like giving him away a second time. But I had trusted my son's voice when he said it was only a formality, trusted his fiancée's smile when she promised, We'll make sure you're comfortable, trusted the idea that family, above all else, was safe. And what had that trust earned me? A legal document quietly tucked in a drawer, signed without a word, waiting to push me out of my own life. I wanted to scream, to confront them at breakfast, slam the papers on the table, demand an answer. But when I heard their bedroom door open, the sound of their easy laughter drifting down the hallway, I couldn't. My son's face, weary from long days at work, still carried the same boyish light when he smiled. I had protected that light since the day he was born. How could I now be the one to shatter it? So I folded silence around me like a shawl. That evening, I tried to busy myself. I ironed linens, polished the silver, dusted shelves no one noticed. But every task only reminded me I was preparing a home for them, not for me. At dinner, they talked about wedding favors and honeymoon flights. She leaned into him, whispering, and he laughed the way he used to laugh with me. I set down my fork and excused myself, unable to sit through another meal where I felt like a shadow. In my room, I opened the cedar chest where I kept the most important things: family photographs, my wedding veil, a stack of letters yellowed with time. And there, beneath the veil, was a folder I hadn't touched in years, the original deed to the house. I ran my fingers over the faded ink, my husband's signature strong and steady. and as I read through the legal text, my eyes caught on a line that tightened my breath. Grantor retains life estate, right of residence for duration of natural life. I read it again and again. Life estate, residence for life. My hands trembled, but not from fear this time. For the first time in weeks, a spark of strength returned to me. My husband had been careful. He had thought ahead, guarded us even from beyond the grave. They could shuffle papers, sign contracts, whisper about privacy, but this house, this anchor, still carried his protection. That night, lying in bed, I did not sleep much, but I did not cry either, because I understood something vital. Trust is a gift, but it is not blind. And love for a son who had lost his way, was not the same as surrender. The cost of trust had been high, but now I had something stronger, proof, and when the time came, I would use it. The deed sat on my lap like a shield. I traced the words again and again, letting their meaning sink into my bones, residence for life. My husband's foresight had saved me. He must have known, whether by instinct or by the wisdom of age, that one day I would need protection even from the people I loved most. But protection on paper was not enough. Paper could be hidden, argued over, twisted. I needed to be ready, not just for the law, but for the moment when truth would finally demand its voice. The next morning, I made an appointment at the same law office where my husband and I had once signed our names side by side. The receptionist was new, her smile polite, but the smell of polished wood and leather-bound books pulled me back in time. When the lawyer entered, older now, gray dusting his temples, he greeted me with warmth. "Mrs. Walsh, it's been years." I unfolded the deed with careful hands. "I need you to confirm something for me," I said. His eyes scanned the page, his brow lifting with recognition. "Yes, your husband was meticulous. This clause guarantees your right to live in the property until your passing. Irrevocable." The word settled in me like an anchor, irrevocable. "And if anyone tries to challenge it?" I asked. "They won't succeed. This is ironclad." I exhaled, a breath I felt I had been holding since the day I signed those other papers. "Thank you," I whispered. On the walk home, the late summer air felt lighter. The trees lining the street were beginning to hint at autumn, their edges brushed with gold. For the first time in weeks, I noticed the beauty of it. Still, strength alone did not erase the ache. I carried the knowledge of my son's betrayal everywhere with me, like a stone in my pocket. Each glance, each word from him, reminded me of how easily he had allowed her to redraw the lines of our family. That evening, as I folded laundry, I overheard them in the hallway. "She's not going to move out," his fiancée said, her tone edged with irritation. "She will," my son replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "We just have to give it time." "Time?" she scoffed. "We're about to be married. This should be our space. If she really cared about us, she'd step aside." I gripped the sheets in my hands until the fabric crumpled. They spoke as if I were a burden to be managed, not the woman who had built their very foundation. But anger was not what my husband had taught me. He had taught me patience, strategy, the wisdom of timing, so I waited. I smiled through dinners, nodded through their plans, wrapped more gifts, and tied more ribbons. I became the mother they thought they were outsmarting, docile, harmless, fading into the background. But in my room at night, I organized my files. I kept copies of the deed, stored one in a safe deposit box, another in the lining of my cedar chest. I wrote notes of dates, conversations, the little slights that revealed their true intentions. And I prayed, not for vengeance, but for clarity. That when the moment came, my son would see the truth of what he had nearly thrown away. The wedding day drew closer. The house filled with deliveries, boxes of wine glasses, crates of flowers, garment bags rustling with silk. Laughter echoed down the halls, but I felt the undercurrent, sharp as broken glass beneath bare feet. One evening, as I carried a tray of folded linens to the guest room, I caught her watching me. Not smiling, not thanking me, just watching, as if measuring how much space I still took up. In that glance, I saw her certainty. She believed she had already won. I lowered my eyes, hiding the flicker of resolve burning brighter in me now, because she did not know what I held. She did not know the words my husband had left behind, carved in ink stronger than any scheme. And when the time came, she would learn. The morning of the rehearsal dinner arrived gray and restless, the sky heavy with unshed rain. The house buzzed with voices and footsteps. a parade of relatives and friends carrying flowers, boxes, and laughter. To anyone else, it might have seemed a joyful chaos. To me, it felt like the house was being dressed for its final performance, as though I were backstage, invisible in my own theater. I carried trays of glasses into the dining room, careful not to stumble. My son was moving briskly from room to room, checking lists, answering questions. His fiancée followed close behind, her clipboard in hand, her tone brisk and decisive. "Mom, could you stay out of the kitchen for a while?" she said as I placed the glasses on the table. "The caterer needs space to set up." I paused, a glass still in my hand. "Of course," I said softly, though my chest tightened. I had cooked in that kitchen for decades, but in a single sentence, I was dismissed like an intruder. That evening, as guests filled the house, I found myself standing at the edge of conversations, smiling politely when spoken to, but never truly included. My son moved among them, beaming, his arm around his bride-to-be. Every so often his eyes met mine, and there was something there, hesitation, maybe guilt. But then it was gone, swallowed by her laughter pulling him away. When dinner was served, I noticed there was no seat reserved for me at the head table. Instead, I was placed at the far end, between distant relatives who barely remembered my name. I smiled through it, cutting my chicken into neat, small bites, listening to speeches that celebrated love and new beginnings. No one mentioned the foundation on which this new house was being built. My sacrifices, my husband's foresight, the years carved into these walls. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone, I heard them in the living room, their voices carried through the half-closed door. "She just doesn't fit," his fiancée said sharply. "This isn't her life anymore, it's ours. After tomorrow, she needs to step aside." My son's voice was lower but not firm. "I know, we'll figure it out." Step aside, the words landed like a verdict. The next day, the wedding itself shimmered with all the beauty money could buy. White roses lined the aisle. Silk ribbons fluttered in the warm September breeze. Guests rose as the bride walked forward, radiant in lace, her eyes locked on my son's. Cameras flashed, and for a moment, even I was caught in the swell of joy. But beneath it all, the tension hummed. At the reception, I watched her lean close to him, whispering in his ear, her hand brushing his chest as though to claim him in front of everyone. She greeted relatives with wide smiles, but when her gaze met mine across the room, the smile thinned into something harder, something triumphant. During the first dance, when my son spun her under strings of fairy lights, I sat alone at the corner table, hands folded in my lap. Applause thundered around me, but I felt only the quiet throb of loss. And yet, under that ache, a steadier beat was rising, resolve. That night, after the last song faded and the guests departed, I returned to my room. I opened the cedar chest once more, pulling out the deed, its inked promise shining under the lamplight. Right of residence for life. My husband's voice echoed in memory. "This house will hold us. No matter what." I pressed the paper to my chest and whispered, "It will. It still will." Because the storm was coming, and when it broke, I would not be washed away. The morning after the wedding dawned bright and sharp, as if the world wanted to mock the heaviness pressing against my chest. The house smelled faintly of roses and champagne, the remnants of a celebration that had left me feeling like a ghost in my own life. I had risen early, as always. Old habits do not vanish with age. I brewed coffee, buttered toast, and sat at the kitchen table with the morning light spilling across the wood. For a moment, I let myself breathe, the quiet wrapping around me like a fragile shield. But quiet rarely lasts. Her footsteps came first, quick, decisive, heels clicking against the hardwood. She entered the kitchen still wearing the afterglow of triumph, her silk robe cinched tightly, her eyes sharp as polished glass. "Good morning," I said softly, offering the smallest smile. She did not return it. Instead, she pulled out a chair opposite mine and sat, her movements deliberate. "We need to talk," she said. The toast grew cold in my hands. "I think it's time you start considering other arrangements," she began, her voice coated in sugar but with steel underneath. "You deserve a place of your own, somewhere peaceful. A nice condo, maybe, somewhere smaller." I stared at her, the woman who had just promised before God and witnesses to cherish my son. "This is my home," I said, my voice low but steady. She tilted her head, her smile thin. "It was, but things are different now." We're starting our life together, and having you here, it doesn't work. For us? For us, the words twisted like a knife. At that moment, my son entered, his tie half knotted, his hair damp from the shower. He froze at the sight of us, sensing the charge in the air. "What's going on?" he asked. "She was just explaining," his bride said smoothly, "that she understands it's time to move on." I turned to him, my heart heavy but my hands steady. "That's not what I said." His eyes flickered between us. I saw the conflict there, the boy I raised wrestling with the man he thought he had to become. He opened his mouth, but no words came. I reached into my bag, pulled out the folder I had carried with me for weeks, and laid it on the table. The sound of paper against wood was louder than it should have been. "What's this?" he asked. "The truth," I said. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the lines. I watched his face change. Confusion, then recognition, then something close to fear. He looked up at me, his voice unsteady. "Dad, he left this?" "Yes," I said. "Your father thought ahead. He knew this house was more than property, it was our life, and he made sure I could stay here no matter what." His wife leaned forward, her hand gripping his arm. "Don't let her guilt you. Papers can be challenged. Lawyers can be paid. We can fight this." But I saw it in his face, the way his shoulders slumped, the way his eyes refused to meet hers. Somewhere inside, he remembered. He remembered the man his father had been, the lessons he had taught, the promise of family that should not be broken. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then finally he spoke. "She's not leaving," he said quietly. His bride's eyes widened. "What? She's not leaving," he repeated, firmer this time. "This is her house, too. It always has been." The chair screeched against the floor as she stood abruptly, her face a mask of disbelief. "So that's it. You're choosing her over me?" "I'm choosing what's right," he said, though his voice trembled. I wanted to comfort him, to soften the blow, but I knew this was a moment he had to face on his own. She glared at me then, her eyes blazing with something that went beyond anger. It was defeat, wrapped in bitterness. Without another word, she turned and stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The kitchen was quiet again, but the air between us was heavy. My son closed the folder and placed it gently back in front of me. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I know," I said, "but you should have asked." He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "I'm sorry, Mom." I reached across the table, my hand resting over his. "It's not too late to remember who you are." Outside, the sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the kitchen. The storm had broken, not entirely, not cleanly, but the first crack of light had appeared. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. The days after the wedding unfolded like the quiet after a storm. The flowers wilted in their vases, the ribbons sagged on the chairs, and the laughter of guests became only echoes. The house, my house, breathed again, slower, steadier, as if reclaiming its rhythm. My son came to me one evening, his tie loosened, his eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared meals and silences, and for a long while he said nothing. Finally, in a voice rough with regret, he whispered, "I made a mistake." I did not ask him which mistake he meant, the papers, the silence, or the blindness to love twisted into control. Perhaps he meant them all. Perhaps he didn't know where to begin. "I let her convince me," he continued. "I thought I was building a future, but I was tearing apart my past. And you, Mom, you were the only one who ever stood by me." Tears pricked my eyes, but I held his hand, steady and firm. "The beautiful thing about family," I told him, "is that it bends, it bruises, but if you let it, it heals." In the weeks that followed, he filed for annulment. It was painful, yes, and messy, but he walked through it with a strength I had not seen in him for years. Perhaps losing nearly everything had taught him what truly mattered. We settled back into the house together, not the way it had been when he was a boy, but not as strangers either. Slowly, gently, we built new routines, shared coffee in the morning, walks in the cool evening air, conversations that reached deeper than they had in years. The house, our house, felt alive again, not because of the walls, but because of what we were learning inside them. I often thought of my husband then, of his foresight, his quiet wisdom written into that single clause of protection. It was not just legal language, it was love carved into permanence. And as I watched my son find his footing again, as I saw him return to the man he was meant to be, I realized something simple but profound. A mother's place is not defined by papers or signatures, but by the love she gives and the strength she refuses to surrender. That love had held us together. That love had carried us through betrayal. That love would guide us into whatever came next. Dear friends who have walked with me through this story, thank you. Stories like these remind us that family is fragile and precious. That trust must be guarded, and that love, true love, demands courage. May you hold your own families close, protect what matters, and never underestimate the quiet strength of a parent's heart. I wish you health, peace, and homes filled with laughter. May your days be blessed, and may your families be happy. Until next time, thank you for listening.